With that, I want to say welcome, welcome, welcome to all of you. This is really great that we have you here in another kind of virtual knowledge sharing conversation. I think just from the conversations that I've had with each of you around, where you're at with your business and how you're thinking about being an impact entrepreneur, this is one of those questions that has come up a lot to say, what does it mean to be an impact entrepreneur? Can I make money as an impact entrepreneur? How do I measure it all and make sure that I'm not making it up? And so I think this is going to be a really great conversation. And so I welcome you. As usual, it would be really great if you could switch on your camera, if possible, to make it feel a little bit more human in this virtual room. But yeah, we will have a Q&A session as well after the conversation, as we usually do as well. And there will be plenty of opportunity for you to ask your questions. So I'm going to stop there by welcoming onto our virtual stage we call her the boss lady, the head of Oribi, Tux, who I'm very excited agreed to moderate this conversation today. So I'm going to hang out in the background and hand over to Tux, who's going to introduce our guests and have the conversation. Cool. Over to you, Tux.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much to me and all the pressure. I'm so glad to be here with you guys again and to kind of hear your thoughts, and nice connecting with Ree again and connecting with Kurt again and being in Tumi's kitchen again. So that's really cool. Just to note that this is a non-judgmental space. I'm probably doing this first time as a moderator, so let's see how we go. So there's no hecticness there, hey? Okay, cool. So maybe I'll give some time for our guests just to introduce yourselves. Maybe you could just tell us your name, what you are doing and what you're up to, maybe a little bit of your background if you want to, and just an interesting thought, some interesting insights you'd like to tell us. Even if it's your favorite childhood meal.
Fine. Hi, everyone. I feel like it's been one of those days or those weeks as well. I'm feeling so exhausted, but I'm happy to be here. My name is Rirhandzu Marivate. And yeah, I have a background as an ecologist, and I've worked in the environmental space for a long time before moving into foods. And I think that was just a kind of a process of really kind of figuring out how I could actually have the best impact while still holding the space as an ecologist, really. So I currently work as a regenerative food systems practitioner at the Sustainability Institute, and I oversee a number of projects, but my main one is called the Living Swells Community Learning Farm. And I started with it. It's almost been 4 years now. I feel like the journey has been long because COVID has been part of most of it, and that has been hectic. But I think just being thrown in the fire has also made it that we kind of make sense of a lot of things quickly. So my project really focuses on how we support small-scale regenerative farming. And then use it as a platform for addressing local food security. And I think just holding training and development at the center. And so we really focus on young farmers, particularly young farmers of color and particularly women, and really, getting them to be capacitated, not only as just farmers, but then also hoping that they get, management skills to really make it into entry-level commercial farming. One day, hopefully. And then so I feel like that's me. What's interesting about me? Oh yeah, I'm also recovering from a 5-day trip trekking in the Drakensberg, so my mind is a little bit slow this week. Thanks.
Nice, thank you so much. We welcome your slowness. We need it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that's the pace at which things ought to go when you're, in the mountains. That's reminds us of those things. And it's actually just, yeah, unfair, artificial pace of life that we often get tossed into, even working with farming. Yeah, so hello everyone, my name's Kurt Ackermann. You may tell from my accent, I didn't grow up in South Africa, but I've been living here for 22 years. I grew up in the States. I've been an entrepreneur in various guises since 1992. I'm not going to bore you with all of the details, but I really got my introduction into the food system and urban farming 10 years ago when I was a volunteer to help start a community food garden down the road from where I live. I'd spent decades in various forms as a consultant, helping organizations with strategy and business planning and monitoring and evaluation. And I jumped into food gardening without a plan, without a strategy, without a clue. 10 years later, I'm the CEO of a nonprofit trust that's responsible for this stuff and still trying to figure it out as we go, kind of building the strategy and understanding the path ahead from kind of along the way and hopefully seeing around the next corner as best we can. And from our start at the Rirhandzu City Farm, we've really focused our work on community development through growing food together, essentially. We also run the Food Dialogues, which is a platform for bringing a greater diversity of voices into the conversations about our food system and strengthening networks in that way, raising some of the underheard issues that are important within our food system and to role players in it, and also diversifying the audiences that are thinking about their relationship to food in a systemic way and not just about a transactional way, you know, buying or eating or cooking or whatnot. So one of the things you'll learn from me is that I talk a lot, so I'm going to stop there, and I'm sure the questions will draw out anything that may be of relevance. I should say I'm very pleased to be on this platform with Rirhandzu, but also with Oribi, an organization that I've known since its very first days in Cape Town, and it's just really a thrill to see what you guys have managed to do in your persistence and achievements, and I'm just pleased to be part of it today. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. Thank you for that. I think the nice thing to hear, kind of like hearing about both your stories, is kind of this thing of having to act now, but also this thing of time and letting time evolve with the actions that you're doing to get to a certain place. I think that's quite interesting. And I would say also, just to add to Kurt, like I would say probably the work that you're doing, even more than you use the word not transactional, is also really much about relational work with the food system, which I think is important work. And I love seeing what you guys are doing in that space, or folks are doing in that space. So to start us off, maybe I think let's start with the big question, like, what is impact? I mean, it would be, if all of us here, I would hope that there's some sort of impact that we are aiming for or that we're pursuing. But like personally, I think the word impact is also starting to get very scary for me. Maybe because, you know, if you think about the science and the word impact, is like impact doesn't necessarily always mean it's something that is good, if that makes sense. And I don't want to put a nature to it, but I just want to hear from your perspectives, kind of what does impact mean to you?
Before I answer the question, I would like to say also, I feel like I learned quite a lot from Kurt, because with figuring out a lot of the nitty-gritty of my own work, been following quite a lot of what you've been doing, Kurt, and I think, yeah, just also being offered a lot of platforms and opportunities to learn from you has been really useful and amazing. And then I think also through Oribi, I also was what is I? A mentee. I don't remember. Through the food systems program, last year? Yeah, this time has been very quick. And I think we learned quite a lot in terms of understanding your own project, particularly through the lens of the theory of change. And this is what Kurt brought about with your lecture last year. And so I think, to me, what impact is really understanding that you're always kind of in line with your why, and then also looking at how that really kind of addresses it effectively or efficiently, not necessarily efficiently, but making sure that you always contextualize your why, because impact can be a good intention, but then it can always fall to the wayside if you're not necessarily understanding all the different proponents that bring in that why. And I feel I always grapple with that, and I'm still grappling. I mean, Kurt has 10 years, I still have almost 4 years in figuring these things out. But then I think one of the biggest things is just realizing and having, I think, an overarching vision of what you're wanting to achieve and why, and then seeing that you are able to put in some sort of measurements in place. And then as long as you have that overarching overall higher objective or vision, not necessarily being really, bent down to saying that these are my measurements and then this is what I'm going to stick to, because as we know, particularly in complex food systems, things always change. It's always just going back to really understanding and making sure that you're always addressing that why. And then I think in terms of measuring it is then also kind of seeing and learning from where you come from and how to improve that. And then so for me, I see that as continuous learning and impact. Yeah, I think, I'm just going to say that for now and then just let Kurt explain it more theoretically.
No, I think that's great. I mean, I come at it slightly differently. And for a long time, I've had a personal, I don't know if it's really a beef, but just it registers with me as the word impact got into kind of mainstream English, because impact means to hit, right? There's an impact. And people would use it when they really mean effect, right? I'm having an effect on someone. Oh, it's having an impact. And we kind of amplify our language for dramatic effect or, whatever it is. And I think in everyday use, we use the word impact kind of loosely like that, and that's fine, right? Language changes. No, I'm not trying to be a language police, but I noticed the change over time. And so we use that, that had an impact on me, kind of thing. And that's not really the way I think we want to use it in our own kind of work when we're talking about our why, I think, as Rirhandzu said quite well. And so for me in this space, I think of two different aspects. One is very much along the lines of what Rirhandzu was sharing, which is kind of impact is about making the right kind of difference in the world through my work and through my being and through my relationships, and always checking back on that, because that may change over time. It should change over time, otherwise something's wrong. But the other is sort of a technical sense of impact where, one's asked by a funder or a board or one's own, team, project managers or whomever, to say, what's our impact? Let's measure that. How do we measure our impact? And I think that's a much more complicated reality, because it's often very hard to measure impact. In that technical space, we think about impact as the sort of the broadest causal consequence, right? The broadest effect. So if we look, for those of you who remember back in the day with the treatment action campaign, when they were really trying to affect what was happening with HIV treatment and prevention of transmission, and the impact was on the prevalence of AIDS and HIV in South Africa. And, for an organization, and the reason I talk about the treatment action campaign is I actually did a narrative review of them. I was brought in by one of their funders to assess impact. And it's almost impossible to draw a causal relationship because so many factors affect HIV prevalence, right? Overall health, the affluence of communities, other people's role, how much the Gates Foundation puts into funding this or that, South African policy. So you're even as powerful as TAC was, to say we did this and that moved the needle in terms of HIV prevalence is almost impossible, if not impossible. And to measure it well would be foolishly expensive. And so often impact is like the holy grail, but we actually can't get there. And I think we need to be at peace with that for ourselves. So that kind of gut check level that Rirhandzu was talking about, I think is really important as entrepreneurs, kind of making sure we're aligned with what it is we think we should be doing, and are we really doing it, and is that still good for us? And for funders or whoever it is to be able to say, look, we may not be able to measure that, but we have very good indications that we're making a positive contribution. And it's those good indications that one needs to talk about. So is that outcomes, or, we can get into the technical structure of that. But I think we need to be at peace with the fact that impact may have technical meaning, but getting there may never really be the reality, particularly in kind of the social enterprise space. If you're a profit-seeking entrepreneur, you can measure your impact for your investors by the bottom line, or by your margin, or whatever it is. But that's not the space that we're in here. And then the last thing I would say is we need to be conscious of unintended consequences. So I think, Tox, as you were alluding to, sometimes our impact isn't what we think it is, and it's bad. And so just looking for our why is great, but that can't make us blind to what we're actually doing in a community, in our space. We could be trying to do something amazing in the food system, but if we're crowding out existing local entrepreneurs, we're actually living in a vulnerable community and we're driving them out of business. Our own enterprise may be, going strong, but we're actually decimating others who so just as an example, sometimes our impact just isn't only the positive, and we need to be open to that reality. And then, change what we do accordingly if that's the case. I told you that I'd talk forever, so I'm going to stop there.
No, it's okay. I really like that. I really like both the thoughts that you're bringing up for me, and as I'm reflecting as you're speaking, because I think you actually touched on like one of the key contradictions, should I say. There's like this intuitive, there's this different way of knowing whether change is occurring, that at sometimes you can only measure it through being and experiencing and through relationship with whatever it is that you're trying to make a change, if that makes sense, whether it's people, environment, or the economy. Let's use that as an example. But then there's this aspect where it's like, okay, there are some people who do want indications. I love the word that you use of indications. They want a sense of measurability in order to be able to understand what is it that you're really doing. And I think it's more, and it's still very much probably linked to more of an economic way of thinking, like, because normally with a funder is like, I need to know that I'm getting a return, or I need to know that you're using the money for a good enough cause. And I know there's kind of a trend where philanthropy is changing a bit to loosen up a bit about that. But I think it is important for us to track what is it that we're really doing, and how is it transforming or changing where we're doing. Otherwise, we shouldn't be doing what we're doing, right?
I agree completely. And I'm sorry, just to interject in there, I think what's important for us as entrepreneurs or as leaders is to be confident in saying, look, we can only really be accountable for things where we know we have some degree of control or influence. And that means there has to be a demonstrable, I use the word a causal link. We do A and B happens, or maybe we do A and B and C happen. But at least we know that when we do A, these things happen, and we can measure that and how effective it is, or how expensive, or how frequent. And if we're pushed beyond that, then we're involved in a different category of explanation. Is it storytelling? Is it intuition? Is it, are there other accounts? But the causal link that says I'm doing this and it's causing that to happen is sometimes much narrower than our funders or our backers would like to have. But it's irresponsible of us as entrepreneurs and leaders to claim more impact, if I can use that word, than we can actually prove or substantiate.
I think that is so true. And I'm wondering, Ree, if you have any kind of reflection around that.
Yeah, just listening to that, because I'm also accountable to funders who also, I have two corporate partners within my project. And they also traditionally come from that very much narrow-minded way of thinking of impact. And I think part of my responsibility has been to kind of manage the expectations on what we can do and what we can't do, because it's really irresponsible for you to report on information that is inaccurate. And because then it's actually also responsible for them to then continue with that on, because what are we telling the world? But I wanted to just iterate kind of include the fact that impact is not only from a funding perspective, but then just measuring impact is also really great in also reporting internally, because I think for us, what's been really great is that we came up with a monitoring, evaluation, and learning way of reporting, and then it's been quite a co-created and very much empowering process where different portfolios within the project have been able to kind of keep track of their impact. And then looking back and then seeing what impact that they've had really kind of gives an encouragement of the work that they do in terms of that purpose and continuing that purpose and really increasing their confidence. And I found that that's been quite useful, more so for our team members and beneficiaries rather than our funders, but then also making sure that I still report on minimum impact in terms of what Kurt was speaking of, like what we can demonstrate we are able to impact. And then also being creative in really creating a narrative of storytelling and advocating for the type of impact we have on people, to our funders and the broader community. Yeah, because it's really true that with a lot of it, I mean, I only have 4 years, and I feel like 4 years is not enough to really demonstrate any like, you know, long-term impact or real impact. And then so how do we manage those expectations and, you know, bring our funders along the journey in a way that's responsible, and then in a way that also is transparent in saying that we can't know everything in terms of the work that we're doing and how it impacts our environment.
I really love that. And I love for bringing the point around the internal thing. I think at Oribi, part of the thing that we also question ourselves around is always, if we're looking for information or looking to track what we are doing or the activities, it has to be something that's mutually beneficial. So it has to be information that feeds obviously Oribi's learning process, but also the entrepreneurs themselves are going to learn, because otherwise you're just adding another admin burden to entrepreneurs who are already stretched, for example. And Kurt, you mentioned also, like, if you really want to do like the sophisticated technical style of which is normally called monitoring and evaluation, it's quite expensive, and it's quite an expensive skill to get. And you've both kind of highlighted different ways that you've done already, but I'm just interested to find out, like, for entrepreneurs that are still at the beginning stage, you know, they don't really have capital to get an M&E specialist going. What kind of ways or creative ways, can they embed a way of tracking in their business and tracking kind of what they're doing to show, and also tracking what is the change that is happening because of what they're doing? Some practical sort of things that you've heard of or you've used yourself.
Yeah, that's hard to make a general statement, I think, because it can be so context specific. I would say mostly keep it simple, especially in the early days. And you know, there's a lot of emphasis on change over time, looking at a baseline and kind of what's been changed. But a baseline is also just a snapshot, and it's arbitrary. Right? I mean, life started before you began, and then it carries on after your project started, and so on. So you're choosing a certain point in time and a certain snapshot to use. This is my baseline, and that's good. You know, one needs to do that. Some initial point of reference, right? So if my business started on the 1st of January, then that's when I started to have an effect on the world, and then I'm going to look 6 months later and say, how have things changed? How much money have I earned? How many people's lives have I influenced? How many square meters of soil have I planted? You know, whatever the measure is. And so it's a measure of change. So by the baseline, it's the bottom of your graph, and then you measure change from that. But the bottom of that graph is what I'm saying is kind of an arbitrary number. It's when you've chosen to start. So you can choose it, but if it turns out that you're either measuring the wrong thing or you now need to shift focus, that doesn't mean you have to hold on to that baseline for dear life. You don't arbitrarily chop and change, because then you can't compare over time. But if you need to change, just recognize that it is a snapshot. Just do it make the change with your eyes open and say, guys, we need to set a new baseline now. We understand this better. where we have, and you can go back and try and recreate something, but it really depends on what the purpose of this kind of measuring change is. Because if you are measuring it for a funder, for example, and they say, okay, we gave you X, you said you do, the following things, we now want you to show us what you actually did, and we're going to see if you held up your end of the bargain. That's one way of assessing kind of after the fact. And that's fine, that's their prerogative as funders if they want to do that. For me, kind of running an organization, that's not particularly helpful. A, it's after the fact, and B, if I screwed up, I want to know along the way that I'm screwing up so I can fix it. I don't want to kind of get slapped down after 3 years of doing it. I mean, no one lets it go that long, but you know what I'm saying? So for me, monitoring and evaluation, the more important thing is the monitoring along the way, so that I can make sense. And then if we need to change course, we sit down and say, guys, actually things aren't happening the way we thought. Can we adapt? So anyway, circling back around to your question, I think it's keeping your eye on the goal, and keeping your assessment of your progress toward that goal relatively simple, so it gives you space to shift your approach, to shift what you're paying attention to. Because in the early days, I mean, as Rirhandzu was saying, she's 4 years in and she barely feels like she's getting a handle on the difference that they're making. And I think that's both honest and not uncommon. So I wouldn't beat yourself up trying to get it perfect, and to be kind of frank with any funders or backers that you have and say, look, we're going to do a lot of learning by doing here. So this is what we think we're going to do. And we're going to keep abreast of it along the way. And hopefully that is what we're doing. But if it turns out that something else is happening, we're going to sit down and have that conversation. So that's my experience and my advice. It's easy to give. It's hard to follow. I'm sorry.
Why?
It's hard to keep it simple. We're under pressure. We think highly of ourselves and our ideas. We want to impress people. We want to succeed. And so keeping it simple and keeping that humble honesty, which is then combined with a determination to see it through, is hard.
Do you mind giving an example? Do you mind giving an example of when you had like this really like great indicator or unit of measuring, and you're like, this is really going to tell that we are reaching this as change, and also while you were trying to reach the change, you realized that this is not going to work and had to shift to a more simpler way. Have you experienced that?
I'm trying to think of an example that's relevant within the food system. I mean, I could talk a bit about our journey starting with the Iranian City Farm, where we started with a lot of volunteers and we wanted to make things happen and build community. And that was great. And we were measuring the number of volunteers and volunteer hours and the number of educational programs and school visits and hours of engagement with the number of kids. I mean, it was amazing. But what we found is that all of that beneficial activity was not sustainable, because we were looking at kind of all this good stuff only, and we weren't thinking of ourselves as an organization that needed to look at some of the harder things as well. So harder edge things like our funding, our other kinds of basics. And it took us a long time to realize that volunteers are a double-edged sword. They're free, but they come at a different kind of cost, because the responsibility of kind of keeping things going day to day means you don't have someone under contract with a job to do X. And if you're growing food and your volunteers who are supposed to pitch up to water on a 30-something degree day decide they'd rather go to the beach, you can't fire them, but you can lose your entire crop and everyone's work for the past 3 months in one day. And so we needed to have a slightly more balanced, simpler on the kind of the good stuff, and a little more hard-nosed on the operational stuff, which led us to employing 2 farmers and taking much more of a, thinking of ourselves much more as a kind of a legal entity that had the full range of needs, as opposed to kind of a community project where we all got together and held hands and sang Kumbaya and made the world a better place. So we were all growing up a little bit, which I'm saying it in a way that's quite naive, but there was enough of that. But we realized that we had to get serious now, that we'd set some expectations, we had some commitments, and we needed to gird up for kind of what the journey was going to take.
Cool, thank you for that. I saw your question, Akana. We'll leave it for the Q&A if you don't mind. But I really like what you touched on the sense that, yeah, like actually looking at what you intend to do or change and how it's translating in the current reality can actually also start to tell you information about other parts of your business. So it can start telling you about how you're doing your costing. It can start telling you about the team that you have. Do you have enough capacity in order to actually achieve what the change that you want to see? It can tell you, for example, like what you're saying, the funding and the resources that you need. For example, sometimes it can even tell you that, oh, maybe my approach and my business model is wrong. So maybe I need to change kind of who are my partners and who are my allies in the business. So I think that's a very, very interesting point there. Thank you for that, Kurt. Ree, I don't know if you have any thoughts. Especially for me, if you can just think with us kind of around, because I know you do a lot of storytelling and kind of sharing what it is that you're doing. So just to think around, what does it mean to tell impact stories? And then also knowing that we come from a history of like poverty porn, where our stories have been used in a not so ethical way, if that makes sense. What are the ethics behind telling these stories that make sense?
That is a very deep and very, complicated question. I think some of the ethics or bases that we do in terms of our storytelling is that I never, for example, a lot of our food goes to children and youth that are under 18. And then so when we report, we never share pictures. And then we also, in terms of how much food has gone to how many meals, and we don't want to also then say that, and then this has impacted this child in this way, because we really, like, that's very murky, because we really can't tell with that. And then so we're very careful in how we report up about our impact with children, in terms of also how we tell the story around our contribution towards supporting food security within children and youth space. So one of the languages that we're moving away from is that we've I think it's like, for example, this is how many mouths have been fed, because I feel like that kind of speaks to feeding and that continued narrative of poverty porn. Instead, we say that we've just contributed or supported so many meals that have gone to so many children, because we really want to move away from that, us saying that, without us, they would be struggling or suffering, and moving away from the dependency, and also maintaining the dignity of our beneficiary, so to speak. And I think through COVID as well, I remember we had other partners come along in terms of a lot of our food relief. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we had was that a lot of them wanted to see that proved impact when we were going directly to households. And these are very much, at risk, very food vulnerable, and in already receiving a lot of the food parcels that we're providing was a big leap of faith from their side. And then how do we then also maintain their dignity and making sure that we maintain their confidence? And then so we did receive quite a lot of pushback on not wanting to report and show their faces. And then we also always make sure that the balance in their court in terms of if they want to report back on how they receive the food parcels. I mean, one of the big things, just coming back to measuring that direct impact, was, for example, learning the cultural differences. I mean, my team is mainly Black, and we work within a colored community. So we didn't realize that a lot of the colored community actually doesn't eat things like broccoli and spinach. And so we got a lot of feedback that was negative to say that, hey, like you keep giving us things that we actually don't know how to prepare and eat. Can you grow something else? And then so that's not something a funder would, I mean, even I would want to hear, but then that was also quite useful in changing and then really seeking to understand more of how we can actually grow appropriate fruits for the community. And then so that's been useful. And then I think, yeah, from the sense of our team, because I think Living Soils being a Woolworths or like a partnership project that Woolworths is like one of the main funders, it's very public facing. And then so just making sure that we control the narrative on how we tell our stories is very important. And then like going back to how I was saying that really managing expectations of the funder, it's going to be hard at the beginning, but then just, and I'm hoping that you guys have good funders that actually understand. That's been really pivotal and important to how we walk the journey. And then so I myself won't approve a certain story and narrative that is sent out there.
Did we lose Ri? Oh, okay, so it's not just me. Cool. We'll wait to see if she can connect again. Jimmy, if you can just maybe send her a message. That's, yeah, I think, yeah, again, I really love what she was talking there, kind of around like that stories and story building and the ethics behind it. And I think, yeah, and being careful of the narrative that we are selling. And like she says, especially when it comes to funders, if you've got like a formal funder, is sometimes we're quite scared to provoke those kind of conversations because we are dependent. For example, if you are like a hybrid, hopefully you're a hybrid social enterprise when you're here, if you're here, or you're on your way there. But I also kind of am very strict about when reporting to funders to start to talk about what went wrong and to talk about what did we learn from what went wrong and what are we thinking of doing in order to do something else or in order to like what change our approach and how can you contribute to that now navigation. So I think walking and teaching funders and helping them to navigate with you can also help to transform, because like you will find if you're writing proposals, for example, if you, the same way, like if you're pure for-profit and you're going to the banks, a lot of the instruments that are developed to support social enterprises or to support small businesses do not speak to the context of what the social enterprise or the small business is going through. So the more we can journey with the people that we already have in our tribe, the formal partners like funders, the more that hopefully that they can also start to transform what funding looks like, for example, or what that tracking of change looks like. So thank you for that. Also, I think what I'd really love to hear, Kurt, from you, and I know you did mention a little bit around it, is how do you, especially in a food system context, where like Ri was alluding to, where you might be giving a meal, but there's so many other aspects of food security that that child is needing to fulfill in their own lives on a day-to-day basis. So there's no ways that you're the only person that's interacting with that child. How do you manage that space where you don't fall in love with the idea so much that you feel like I'm the only one that's impacting this child, but understanding that you're part of a bigger system and an ecosystem. Yeah, and how do you create relationships in order to, what I'm alluding to is we're starting to kind of hear around kind of collective impact or talking about shared impact or shared goals or shared vision. Do you have some thoughts around that?
Yeah, first of all, I would say we don't get involved directly in feeding schemes. We have supported community kitchens. We did get one humanitarian grant and aid from the city of Cape Town to support existing community kitchens in one of the wards. And that went really well in terms of our ability to support those kitchens, but was financially disastrous for us. And we wound up subsidizing the city and every which way, and we couldn't afford to do it again. It just, the program was structured in a way that made it, awful. But in that context, we, and I think generally speaking, you know, the real focus is on the community kitchens that are at the coalface. They exist, they created themselves in response to community needs. They know their community. They're the ones that are doing the work. We're supporting them. It's their story. So it's about not centering yourself in that work, but knowing really where the, I don't like to use the word heroes, but where the kind of the narrative center ought to be properly. And the other aspect that I would emphasize that is really building on what Rirhandzu was saying is making sure that there is some element, the appropriate degree of sort of either shared narrative, or that you're sharing the narrative of the people you're working with. It's their story and their words and their voice that you're then kind of passing along in some way that you know has integrity and preserves. You're not just asking them to confess their sins and then you're disclosing that. You're helping them understand who's asking for their story and why, and supporting them in the telling of the story in the way that they want to. And then that becomes what's shared rather than your own kind of interpretive lens on what their experience is. And that's not to say that you can entirely back out of having your perspective, but it shouldn't be the only, it shouldn't be a filter that completely shuts out either the beneficiaries or the community or the customers or whoever it is that you're working with. Their stories and their voices really fundamentally important. For our work, we're constantly withdrawing from the center of the story. Not that we're putting ourselves there, but being very conscious that it's not about us. It's not about us, not about us, it's not about us. It's about the work that we do. Not that we're some sort of, you know, savior. That's always an issue as well. But the kind of the center of the story isn't about us making their lives different. It's about the reality of their lives and how they experience that and what they want to share about what's happening there. And so constantly checking yourself and having an internal culture that is sensitive to that is important. And then I think, as Rirhandzu was also saying, having a diverse team that has a range of lenses and lived experiences, and you know, have the confidence and are empowered to speak up, to say, hey, you know, this is not right, let's whatever, or maybe we're not asking the right kind of questions, or whatever it is essential. You know, at this point, you know, we still have a highly racialized and unequal society, but it's not simply about the race, it's about the diversity that is so important. Because there are times that if one has an international funder, and, you know, for example, I grew up in the West, in the North, and there are times when I can speak to Americans in a way that can be kind of difficult for South Africans to kind of connect straight away. So having that diversity and knowing where that kind of plays a role is important. And then, you know, having a team that's like, Kurt, shut up, you know, back off, and this isn't your time. You know, hopefully they don't have to say that too often, because I've learned over time. But, you know, if they need to say that, I expect them to please do so. You know, so that is an important thing. And if it's not you as an entrepreneur with a small team, then having advisors or having trusted, you know, mentors or others who can give you that kind of voice in your ear that says, let's take a different look at that. Maybe we can approach that slightly differently. That's really important over time to develop.
Thank you for that, sharing with that. I think, yeah, it's really interesting how even with you sharing, like coming with like the conflict of there's the project, there's you yourself are also like a project, and you and the team or the people that you're working with, you are a project. And how does then this change that you're trying to see translate on all those different kind of levels, if you want to call it levels or spheres, if that makes sense. And touching with that is Rirhandzu with us or not? She's not back.
I am back. I am back.
Okay, cool. That sounds better now. Just as a concluding probably thought, there's, I mean, so much more. You can choose your own concluding thought. Let me say it like that. But I'm interested, yeah, to find out because, you know, organizations have their own complexity. Like you say, even development has its own complexity itself. And we ourselves as individuals, we're constantly changing. How do you create that balance? And how do you create kind of that ability to be able to be authentic with as a person in the spaces that you're in, and obviously from an organizational perspective, you shared a little bit, but as a person, how do you create that balance for yourself and checking yourself, if that makes sense?
Is this question I think just checking in with myself, realize that even though I'm managing the project, I'm not the project. And I think this comes back to really the why I'm doing it. It's, you know, the people within the team who I'm really wanting to have empowered and really, you know, take it and self-drive it. And so I see myself as being a sort of a support in terms of wanting to carry that narrative that they already are creating, and then kind of tapping into where the needed gaps and challenges are without really putting myself in front all the time. And I quite like how Kurt put that, is that I'm not the only person who's part of this project, and sure, I shouldn't be the only voice in the project. And so I think one of the things that we've created in our project is that last year we really went through a process of reflection and kind of came out with a value-based approach. We went through a process of understanding what our initial vision and overall objectives were, and then we realized they were too broad, and they're very much obviously facing the side of the funder, and then how can we really make them their own. And I think what came out was then how and what, and, you know, why are we doing the things we're doing, and how are we going to be doing that. And then I gave the process fully to the team to interpret for themselves. And then so through the process really came a number of values, and I'm just going to try and pull them up on my side, because and then so this is what I call shared values. So this is values across the partnerships, and then including within the team and in our beneficiaries in terms of how we want to see ourselves moving. And then I think we use them to always check ourselves. So the first and most important one is always having an inclusive process of co-creation in order to create or foster collective platform is open and democratic, and all voices are heard. And I think the tricky bit is me just kind of making sure that it's balanced from all sides. Second one is valuing partnership and collaboration. And I think, I'm sure you've said this a lot to entrepreneurs, to say that you are not trying to reinvent the wheel, and so don't work in isolation. There really is strength and resilience in really building partnership and collaboration. The third one is looking at making sure that the process or the work is always process orientated. So looking at the types of systems you already have in place, and then making sure that, yeah, you always improve on the processes on how to those systems, and then how you continuously improve that. And I think that's
so we miss a bit of what you're saying, and I think that it was really the values that you were sharing with us was really a beautiful canvas, I think, even for all of us to go with and to think about and in terms of our project. So it would be great if you can type it in the chat. And then for Kurt, before we go into questions, is there any like freshest thought that's sitting with you around, yeah, this subject before we go into the questions?
I think for me, the most difficult but important part of this is honesty. And it's hard because our ego gets in the way, our promises get in the way. And sometimes we also don't want to take credit for things that we've done that have happened well, or, you know, so it's having some way of, you know, whether that's checking in or being checked out or having context or whatever it is, without that sort of honesty with yourself, from your team, with your funders, it's just going to be so much harder. You know, because the only way we learn is by getting things wrong. So there's going to be failure along the way. That's just part of it. That doesn't mean it should be predominantly failure, unless it's a super high risk venture and where the payoffs are, you know, worth it. But it's being honest about, what did we do? Did it work? Did it work well enough? What was my role? Was that good enough? What about my team? All those kinds of things. And just checking that makes all the difference. And then along with that, it's easier to be persistent, to have that grit when you really know what you're facing and you really know what you've accomplished, and that you picked yourself up. You know, the classic, I've fallen 7 times and gotten up 8, or whatever it is, because each time it's gotten better and better. That honesty allows you to hold on to that grit that's just so essential when you're doing, you know, some sort of entrepreneurial venture.
Cool, thank you so much. Tumi, if you don't mind, I think, do you want to take us into questions, or, but just to conclude, or just thoughts, there's always thoughts running in my mind. So I really love how you touched on the aspect that if you are doing something good, social entrepreneurs, we have a tendency of not saying anything about it. And sometimes we feel like the work will speak for itself, and the work doesn't speak. If you're not bringing people into the space to experience the work that you're doing, no one will know what you're doing. And if there really are things that you're doing good, we are doing a disservice not to share those good things that we're doing to ourselves, and to the possibility of even growing what we're doing, or the possibility of another person that probably has a similar idea in a different context, or maybe it's at the public level, at the government level, where they're looking for solutions. I'm talking in a hopeful manner here, but we should be, if we know and we have confirmation through our tracking, through our storytelling, through the relationships that we have with the people, with the work, the people that are involved, or the partners that we have in our projects, we should be sharing that and making it visible for people to know. And I think even in the context of, for example, there's a lot of stories that are untold, or that are invisible in the South African context or the global South context. And people are hungry to find out what's going on, you know, and what can be done. So it's very important with that aspect. And I think just a reminder that it doesn't have to, it's difficult if you're going to try to do it alone, sitting in the boardroom, to think of what is the change I want to see and how am I going to measure it. I think both Kurt and Ree gave us some tips in that if you're wanting to effect change, or you're wanting to have some sort of change with the activities that you're doing, speak to the people, create with people that you're wanting to support, and bring in your aspect of what you can contribute to their lives or to their community or to society, or whatever the case may be that you are trying to do. Because sometimes we also come up with assumptions. Because sometimes if I'm saying, oh, I'm gonna be working in this township, or I might already go in that township with huge assumptions that are not true. And I design a whole program, I design a whole project, I design a whole product and a service, and I think I'm going to be able to sell it. And that's not the case, because all of that was based on assumptions and not co-creating, if that makes sense. And I think if we're co-creating, we also have to be careful that we're rewarding and people are also getting the same return that we're doing. Because also with co-creating, sometimes I always remember a colleague in a previous place where I used to work, we were considering the concept of a flat working structure where we would all be co-creating strategy, organization. And he asked a very clear question. He was like, okay, so if that's the case, does it mean we're all going to earn the same salaries, because it means that I'm also a CEO, I'm also part CEO. So how's it gonna work? So think around that with the co-creation. How are you also co-earning or co-benefiting? That makes sense. Cool.
It's me. So thank you very much for that conversation. I think it's been really, really fruitful just to reflect on what impact means, and some of the really practical ways that you've all shared your perspectives here. So thank you. We already have some questions in the chat. So maybe we'll start with Akona's first question, which is for you, Kurt. Akona wanted to know, like, how did you know that you were winning, especially with constantly evolving strategy and baselines? So you spoke about, you can change those, but keeping your eyes wide open. But essentially, like, when you change it, how do you balance the measurement and how often do you review?
So it's a good question. I don't have a clear answer. I think where we've changed what we're aiming at, it's when it's become clear that we were looking at the wrong thing. So it kind of reveals itself along the way. You start to pick up either friction, or you're not able to make good decisions because you're not measuring the right kinds of things. So what I often talk with my team about is that at least on an internal basis, each of these different forms of feedback help us make decisions as a team and help me make a decision as a leader with input from my team. There's no magic in the numbers. The numbers don't tell you exactly what to do, which is why having a diversity of kinds of data and different sources is important. So getting feedback directly from the people that you're working with, from your team, what the numbers tell you. And then you've got to use your own judgment and experience, and maybe one of your mentors, your board, other people, as you make decisions, either yourself as a leader or with your leadership team, whatever that is, on what to do. So when that process starts to bog down and you're not able to make those decisions, then that's telling you maybe you're looking at the wrong things, or maybe things have changed. For me, that's come largely in two ways. One is either from my board, where they're confused. I'm like reporting to them, and I'm obviously so close to the day-to-day that I get it, and they're like, you got to take a step back and help us out here. Then it tells me that I'm not something's not right. And the other is engaging with whoever the community members are that we're working with, and again, there's a disconnect. It's almost like we're talking past each other. I'm hearing things that just are either new or seem off the mark. So the baseline isn't something we just go around and arbitrarily change. It's kind of, we're paying attention, and it's like, okay, guys, time to relook at this. So my feeling is you'll know. And then when you do that, before you do that, you'll sort of unpack what's driving that urge or that need for you to change. And that's the kind of thing you can share with your team, your funders. Look, guys, we've reached a bend in the road, or we're going up or down, or the context has changed, or team has changed, or whatever the situation is. I mean, COVID was a great series of hairpin bends in all kinds of ways. And in some ways, our team has gotten quite good at reassessing context, because things were changing every couple of months, and thankfully we survived that period. But I think for any early stage venture, things are likely to change quite often, either because you didn't fully understand the markets or communities you're going into, or because you're experiencing success and your place within your kind of competitive set starts to change. You have more leverage, more recognition, more team, etc. So anyway, I'm rambling on again, but I think you'll sort of, if you're in touch with your stakeholders and your data and your team, it will be revealed to you, if I can use that kind of language.
Thanks very much, Kurt. I think from some of what you're saying, what was coming up was the this is very much like, you know, in startup world, when we talk about like lean process or iterating, that's a lot of what you're saying, like speaking to the people you work with, speaking to, you know, them about what their challenges are, what the reality is, and then iterating and pivoting if you need to. So that's very, very interesting. I see Sia's got their hand raised. Sia, yes. What's your question?
Thanks, Dumi. I've got two questions, one for Rirhandzu and another one for Kurt. With Rirhandzu about telling stories, I wanted to find out if you're not showing pictures, for example, in your case for kids and that sort of thing, what do you use for visuals or in the instead of images? Because sometimes I think it adds it makes the report or the wording or the whole page to look nicer. But if you can't show the pictures, for example, if I work with farmers and I can't show the ladies, what can I use to still convey the message? And then for Kurt, I wanted to check in, you mentioned that sometimes you may not be able to measure the impact, but you can use indicators that shows that there is impact at the same time. So from a small business that currently doesn't really have the resources to start measuring and, for example, looking at an M&E tool, what are those kind of indicators that can help to keep track and knowing that after a while, when I can afford to do proper measuring, then I still have the data and it's prepared in a way that it's easily available for measuring. Thank you.
I see that your response is there in the chat. So that's great. Sia, if you can give us a thumbs up if that answers your question. And then maybe Kurt, then over to you, the other question that Sia asked.
Yeah, I just quickly wanted to build on what Rirhandzu was typing in there. I'm not exactly sure what she was saying because I didn't pick it up, but so yeah, I would say you can use images, but first of all, there's the point about children or minors and permission. But Rirhandzu also touched earlier on the element of kind of upholding and strengthening people's dignity. And so they're pictures and then they're pictures. So if pictures are about the poverty porn kind of angle, or look at these poor people that we're helping or whatever, that's completely out of bounds. And I think, I mean, Rirhandzu would never do that, but that's the kind of picture that is just not going to happen. So it's protecting minors and making sure that the visual communication kind of conveys, well, first of all, protects the dignity of the human beings in the photos, and then conveys the kinds of messages that you would want to. And that comes from a proper brief for a proper photographer. I mean, images are really powerful and they're well worth paying for to get them right. But yeah, one's then got to be careful in curating those pictures in those ways. Oh, you're welcome. I hope I got it right. Rirhandzu, she just put it in the comments. All right, so the question about measuring impact. So what in the more formal kind of analytical construct, we talk about kind of a logical framework. So the links between the resources we have and what we do, and kind of how that kind of what happens as a consequence of what we do and the difference that makes, and then the broader impacts. We talk about resources or inputs and activities and outputs and outcomes. And I mean, anyway, one can get lost in this. So we can do PhDs on it. But what I would say is, so the impacts are at the one end of the scale. We're changing the world, right? And the other end of the scale is we've got some money and we've got some time, or maybe some space or whatever it is. And in the middle, you want the links. So we're spending our money and our time doing stuff. And then that is involving certain people and they're participating in those activities. And that's capacitating them, changing their minds, whatever it is. And as a consequence of that, they do something differently in the world. So you're changing the community or whatever, and then that changes people's lives. That reduces the prevalence of HIV, that reduces hunger or malnutrition or whatever. So that's the impact. So, you know, at each step along the way, you can try and track the causal link between my money spent doing a workshop with teachers who then understand better the, you know, whatever it is, soil health or nutrition or something, and then they change how they're teaching in the classroom and how they talk with their colleagues, and that's leading to a better societal understanding of nutrition or lower malnutrition or whatever it is. So along the way, it's understanding where can I actually realistically assess what I'm doing. And usually that's somewhere between outputs and outcomes. So how many people did I have show up at a workshop? I mean, that's a good number, but if 300 people come, but they're just coming for the biscuits, you're actually wasting your time and money. So usually you want to take the next step. What difference did it make? How did they change their behavior? How did they kind of, yeah, what difference did it make in their lives? And so I think the easiest way to measure those things is really by asking the people that you're working with, your beneficiaries, your customers, surveys. It could be formal, it could be informal. What we find working with farmers is that if we walk around with a clipboard or a tablet and we go and ask them questions about what's happening, we get a certain set of answers. But if you really kind of go and hang out with them and you hear the stories and you listen with a particular kind of interest, then out of the sometimes just the back and forth of chit chat or, you know, whatever it is, hanging out together, you hear deeper stories, you hear different kinds of things emerge. And so knowing what it is, what the format of engaging with your customers or with your beneficiaries, or whoever it is also important. Because if we send out a WhatsApp questionnaire or something, we would get, first of all, we probably get nothing, but we would get very stilted kind of responses. So we know that with farmers, we need to take the time, and we have outreach field workers who are there literally every day of the week with those farmers, and their job is to hang out to hear the stories and to chat with them, not in terms of kind of quizzing them like a researcher, but being there so that we can hear what's really going on. And that tells us as directly as anything can what's happening, the good, the bad, the ugly, and everything else. So for us, that's simple. We can afford that. And those narratives are quite powerful. But then we have to have a way, in some cases, of packaging that for our funders. And we've got to work that out. And that's okay. We've come up with ways of kind of clumping some of these stories in ways that do justice to them, but simplify them enough that we can say, you know, here are farmers who are engaged in growing food in their community for income or livelihood, for mental health or physical health reasons, for supporting their community with donating, for raising their kids, like whatever these categories are. They may not use those words, but we can kind of put them into these different categories and speak to that. And then we can align our work with that, or understand why, you know, there are certain farmers who really have such an emphasis on mental health, and what is it about growing food that makes that difference, and how can we support that, and how can we share that with other people in a way that they might recognize that growing food could help with their mental health without stigma or other kinds of issues. So again, I'm talking too much, but it's having a way of engaging with your customers or with your beneficiaries and getting them to share with you what's on their mind. You know, the basic form is picking up the phone or going to see them and saying, how's it going?
Thanks so much for that, Kurt. I think you touched on something that, if I haven't said it to the entrepreneurs yet in their coaching calls, I would definitely say it in future, is you really need to be speaking to people and like getting as close to your customer or your beneficiary or your stakeholders as possible. I think there is sometimes that sense of using forms or kind of like more digital means to record feedback, but there's such a richness in your learning if you actually speak to people. So it's really well worth it, especially at the early stages when, you know, you have the kind of pool that is big enough that you could speak to everybody on a personal level. So before we kind of end off the conversation with final thoughts and that kind of thing, I do want to ask one question which comes up a lot within the entrepreneur cohort, which is the one that Ntux has put here very strategically in the chat, which is around what it means to be financially thriving while pursuing positive change. Because I think there is maybe this like feeling that making money is dirty and opposite to having a positive change. And so I'd like to hear your perspectives, and Rirhandzu, maybe some thoughts from you in the chat around this idea of being financially thriving as an entrepreneur while pursuing positive change. Kurt, what are your thoughts?
This is another difficult one. I think that most people who are going to move into a social entrepreneurship space aren't primarily motivated by money. Otherwise, the social wouldn't be so prominent in their activity. They might get rich and then give it away. But it would be the getting rich part first that was kind of driving them. So initially, I think it's important to recognize that the sort of complexity of values is going to be among social entrepreneurs, and that's good. Financial sustainability is important. It's often the case that entrepreneurs pay themselves last, and that's actually quite dangerous because the entrepreneur is, we need strong entrepreneurs who aren't struggling to pay their own bills, because otherwise the venture is going to fall apart anyway. So taking on all of that burden is difficult. That doesn't mean that you take everything for yourself so that you're thriving, but knowing, I think for each of us, it's knowing what's enough, right? There can never really be enough because there's always someone that's got more, and you compare yourselves to them, and whatever your cohort is, there's always the next and the next and the next. And our society kind of drives us to that, right? The targeted marketers realize that you've now got your own place, so they're selling you home improvements, or if you don't have your own place, they're selling you loans to get your own place, or whatever. There's always more. So it's being honest with yourself about what's enough and what's enough for now. But it needs to be, you've got to be able to pay your bills. You need to be able to have enough comfort that you're not completely stressed and unable to sleep and focus on the work. So finding that balance of enough, and then not beating yourself up for giving that to yourself. That's really important. The other side of it is it's often hard for us to know what we're really worth financially in this space. I think for Rirhandzu and I, in a more classically kind of NGO nonprofit space, it's particularly difficult. If you're an entrepreneur and you're running your own show and you're earning whatever your income is, if you can sell your own product, then you're kind of master of your own destiny in that sense. But if you're working with funders and they're looking at what your salary is, for example, or what you want to be paid from a particular project, it's often hard to defend that, and we tend to lowball it because we want the money for the project. And it's having a network of people, and I think this is one of the areas where Oribi can be helpful. I don't want to put you guys on the spot, but if there is like comparative salary data, where one can say, hey, an early stage venture in this category for someone with my experience, it's realistic for me to expect X per month, and that's backed up by this data. And if for you personally that's enough, then great. Someone's got your back, and you could say this is realistic. If you need more, then yeah, good luck to you justifying it in that way. But hopefully you're earning enough through selling your own product or whatever it is that's okay. But having the knowledge that in the market I should be worth this and I can claim it and substantiate it will really go a long way. And we deal with that all the time, because funders in our world are wanting to have a minimum amount of money for the kind of the overheads, and they have their own formulas for how you calculate that and what you can earn. And we constantly have to push back, and we don't always do it well. And I have to say that I've more than once had a loan account with the organization because I've had to bankroll our organization through the cash flow ups and downs. That happens with all entrepreneurs. Okay, so it's not magic or a problem for me, but just know that if you put yourself in that position of vulnerability and you've got to float your entity that money, that do you have that resilience, or does your organization have a kind of cash reserve that you can draw on? How do you do it? Because you're going to need to tap it either from your own reserves personally or from your organization's reserve. So in order to ride those ups and downs, you've got to make sure that you have enough to be resilient enough when times are tough. If you're just at the edge of survival, the slightest push and you're done. So it's not just about your own sense of self-worth and whatnot. That's important, but it's actually for the good of your business and all your employees and all of your suppliers. If you sail too close to the wind, you're going to put all of that at risk. So anyway, I'm rambling on again, I think, but these are important points. Kind of know what you're worth, know what you need, and be confident in claiming it. And that will give you the resilience when you really have tough times to be able to dip into that if there is a need for that reserve to see you through.
Thanks very much for that, Kurt. Rirhandzu, I also really like what you're saying there in the comments about, like, without your financial stability, you are actually doing a disservice to the project. And I quite like that orientation. I might be biased, but, I think those of us with like a social inclination, we might be shy to say, this is what I deserve, this is what I need. But actually, if you think about it in the context of the people you're serving and how you might be better off service if you are well funded for your business, or you are able to have enough salary that you have enough to eat and can rest, those kinds of things, that it all comes around. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. So I think before we end off this evening's conversation, maybe just one thing that we take away from the conversation. I'll start with Ntaks, actually, to say, like, if there is nothing else that we remember from today's conversation, what is the one thing you want everyone on this call to remember from your point of view?
Good question. I think to remember that it sounds difficult, but there's simple ways of tracking the change that you're trying to do, and also that you can do it with people. You can do it with the people that you are creating products and services for, and you can do it with your team as well, and find ways of expressing that in a way that is useful for you and obviously useful for any other interested stakeholder. That's more.
Cool. Thanks, Ntaks. Kurt, one thing, if we remember nothing else.
Oh, one thing. I think as an entrepreneur, it's being able to keep your bearings, right? And so that's I think we've touched on all of that. It's for yourself to be grounded and honest and have good kind of input and good advisors and mentors, but it's all about keeping your bearings, because it's going to be up and down. You're going to be knocked around, and if things go really well, you're going to have to change really quickly. I mean, stasis is death in nature, and I think that's true in entrepreneurship. So do your best to stay grounded and be honest, and surround yourself with people who will tell you what you need to hear, even if it's bad news. And then that helps you trust yourself. So be grounded as best you can.
Yeah, great. Trust yourself is one of the pillars of our trust system at Oribi. So that really hits home. And Rirhandzu, I see you've mentioned here, start simple and always go back to your why or your vision to make sure that you're on track. And also be fine with changing. That's the only constant, I'm afraid. Yeah, learn to adapt with your core values and vision intact. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much to Kurt.
Oh, yes, one more, just one more.
Oh, come on.
Just one more. But this is the most important one. All of this can only happen if you're open to feedback. Fall in love with feedback. Yeah. That's all I wanted to add.
It was worth it. Absolutely. So thank you very much, Kurt, Rirhandzu, and Tux for moderating this conversation. To everybody on the call, thank you very much for joining us.